Did you ever imagine that boxing was born thousands of years ago and was much more brutal than it is today? From ancient Egypt to the great modern stadiums, this sport has undergone a gigantic revolution, both in rules and equipment, and even in the way of scoring. In this video, we will dive into the history of boxing, understand how the first fights came about, how each period brought important changes, and why today we have 3-minute sounds, use of gloves, and much more. Come on, my noble greetings, how are you? Boxing has very old roots, look at it, around. 3,000 years before Christ, there were records, right? Back in ancient Egypt, fist fighting there, people wore leather straps on their hands and fought with part of rituals or military training on the Putamian table, and in Crete from 2000 to 1000 BC, similar competitions took place. Today we even have sculptures that show the fighters in guard and strike positions. In ancient Greece, boxing entered the Olympic Games in 688 BC, and it used the name Pygmalion. Famous fighters and even specific gyms, it was so much respect that even philosophers documented the techniques. Then came the Romans, right? They loved the bloody spectacle and invented the chestros, which were gloves, pointed metal, they come alone. The fights became so violent that many people were seriously injured, died, and worst of all, lost the fight. When the Roman Empire fell, boxing practically disappeared from Europe. In average reality, boxing was not well recognized, it survived more as a form of self-defense or a military practice hidden there. Already in the English Renaissance there around the 17th century, it began to resurface with force. And in 1681, as were the first documented fights in England, and there by 1695, James Figg, he opened the first boxing school in London, and he ended up making official this business of teaching the art of boxing. And look how crazy, at that time everything was still very free. There was no glove, there was no timed round, and that business was going on there until the... Does anyone fall or give up? It was the modern rules, 1700 to 1900, Brown's rules. So there it was in 1743, Jack Brown, and the guy thought, now he has to get this business organized, right? So he started to put some slightly more differentiated rules. He started to prohibit, according to his rules, blows below the waistline is. He put that when the fighter falls is and does not get up. After 30 seconds, it was the end of the fight, and that was it, right? The first rules, he started their AA Institute, right? And this was one of the first steps we took to have something more similar to the sport, only it was still everything without gloves, but at least at that moment they started to include the rounds, right? Which was when someone fell to the ground. He finished a round and had 30 seconds to go back to 1835 with a review. Then back in 1853, London price ring rules was born, and they created the idea of the ring being square, right? Have a specific size. It's the ropes on all sides too determined. It's just that the round was going to end when the fighter fell and there was 30 seconds to take a break for him to get up, right? It was still in the glove freestyle, right? Bare-knuckle, or for those who played Mega Drive in the past, bare-knuckle is he still rolled the grips, right? And punched the ground, huh? Almost an ancestry there from MMA, right? But still, so many rules. In 1867, the Marcus rules were born. Marquess of Queensberry, the rules, in fact, they were created by John Graham Chambers, right? That he was the Marquess's friend, right? And the person took advantage of the Marquess's fame there to give it the name, right? And make it more popular there, right? And that's right, right? Boxing has taken on a more modern face, hasn't it? It started. The mandatory use of gloves is. It's the sounds had 3 minutes for 1 minute of rest. That part of wrestling with more prolonged trenches was also for A, was banned, and the knockout started to be from 10 seconds. So he gave me a knockout count of 10. And with that, the fights, they became much less brutal and more technical, right? Although they were still pretty intense. From 1900 to 1950, at the beginning of the 20th century, boxing became much more popular. In 1904, it was included in the 100th Olympic Games. By 1920, the first weight category divisions emerged to prevent a gigantic fighter from facing a very small one. In 1927, the use of a mouthguard became mandatory, and in 1929, the New York Athletic Commission helped to standardize wrestling within the United States. And with that, boxing began to professionalize with big events and champions began to appear. In the contemporary era, which was from 1950 to the present, professional organizations began to be born, right? Where was AWBC, WBVF born? Yubao BC, for example, she was born in 1963, Albaba in 62, AEBF in 83, Yalabo in 88. Each entity there has its belt, its ranking. Their main base is still that of the Marquess of Queensberry, but she brought it, right? Some developments in the scoring and security part, and speaking of security, today it's much bigger than it used to be, right? There are neurological exams that are mandatory, magnetic resonance imaging, the protocols that we follow in relation to concussion, OA, or that control, and weight loss. Much more, huh? And in the 80s, for example, the rounds were limited to 12 because before they reached up to 15 rounds, right? This happened there after the death of a fighter in 1982, which ended up shaking the sport. And there, in the early 70s, was when women's boxing also began to gain strength, right? Which is one of the first licensed female fights, right? And in 2012, women's boxing finally entered the Olympic Games. And today, people follow with great female names, right? Who shine in their kidneys, including Brazilian champions. And they also have their own divisions and their own titles, right? Major innovations in equipment. Over time, the boxing gloves have become more technological, the foams have had a higher quality, higher density, Velcro fasteners, antimicrobial materials is included, including a glove. Very interesting. What am I going? I will leave the link for you to know here that it is very worthwhile. She has all this more modern material, and that I'm sure will help a lot in your training. Custom made mouth guards also started being made, right? No more moldable ones, right? Even though they still exist, but today professional wrestling is already with tailor made protectors. In the past, when you use the helmet, right, in the fights, armors have already started. They have already put some sensors on helmets to try to make 11 points, but it ended up not going very far, and now they are already doing studies, right? Regarding electronic scoring, the idea of the study is to make the sport more transparent and safer, right? It's good, at least it is, and that's the idea. In the last fight, including between Taiston Furia and Alexander Music, measurement was used, right? Unofficial of using OIA to do this part of the score is an idea. Let's see how these things go from here. That's perfect. Fundamental current rules today. What we have as a fundamental rule are mainly the weight categories, right? There are currently 17 professional weight classes. The weigh-in takes place about 24 hours before the fight in the scoring system that still uses the famous points muse, right? Which is when whoever wins the round gets 10 points and the other gets 9 points or less, right? Depending on TV down or a level of dominance of the fight, right? You have it too. Only a score, a system of criteria based on effective cups, domain, the technique presented, the aggressiveness, also has the protections that are mandatory. Every fighter, he needs to be there with proper gloves, mouth guard, genital guard, bandage. In the amateur, sometimes a helmet is still used, but this still depends a lot on the rules and which institution is doing that fight. The rounds are the title fights. They have 12 rounds of 3 minutes each, and usually in the female, the fights of title are 10 rounds of 2 minutes. Already in the amateur, in the Olympic, there are 3 rounds of 3 minutes. Part of arbitration, right? Son is a central referee in the ring, right? To maintain order, paralyze what role and three side judges for the scoring part, right? Of course, right? There is always an official doctor who is on duty over the evolution of the rounds, right? So before, back in 1743, fights had no time limit, only ended with knockout or withdrawal there after 70 years of after 1743 with Brown's rules. You didn't have a fixed time round yet, did you? But she stopped when someone fell, so she had the 30 there. Seconds into the interval, when he entered London Price's part, they kept the idea of the round being undefined yet, but the ring got bigger at that time in 1867 with the rules of the Marquis of Queensberry, right? Where was this discussed of all the other rules there, but mainly referencing the 3 minutes for 1 minute rest in the 20s. 8AA50 made there the maximum of 15 rounds official, right? Minutes per title, the idea of it at that time there to have 15 rounds is because more things didn't happen, like what happened with Endable and Jack Burke back in 1893, right? We already talked about this fight here, which is known as the biggest fight of all, and in 1982, right, where they reduced the rounds there to 12 rounds, especially in title fights, right? And non-title fights are worth 10 rounds, right? Boxing. He traveled a huge path of combat, without glove and without rules, defined there in Egypt, in Greece, until the sport organized with category, score, and all this professional industry that we have today. And if you enjoyed this historic trip, subscribe to the channel. We have a lot more content about fights here and curiosities analysis, right? Everything that's still to come out there. Okay, we're going to the next round. See you later.